Chapter 1 of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hepgood. Book 1, Book 1st, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 1, The Charybdis of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and the Scylla of the Faubourg du Temple. The two most memorable barricades which the observer of social maladies can name do not belong to the period in which the action of this work is laid. These two barricades, both of them symbols under two different aspects of a redoubtable situation, sprang from the earth at the time of the fatal insurrection of June 1848, the greatest war of the streets that history has ever beheld. It sometimes happens that even contrary to principles, even contrary to liberty, equality, and fraternity, even contrary to the universal vote, even contrary to the government by all for all, from the depths of its anguish, of its discouragements and its destitutions, of its fevers, of its distresses, of its miasmas, of its ignorances, of its darkness, that great and despairing body, the rabble protests against, and that the populace wages battle against, the people. Beggars attack the common right. The ochlocracy rises against demos. These are melancholy days, for there is always a certain amount of night, even in this madness. There is suicide in this duel, and those words which are intended to be insults, beggars, canaille, ochlocracy, populace, exhibit, alas, rather the fault of those who reign than the fault of those who suffer, rather the fault of the privileged than the fault of the disinherited. For our own part, we never pronounce these words without pain and without respect. For when philosophy fathoms the facts to which they correspond, it often finds many a grandeur beside these miseries. Athens was an ochlocracy. The beggars were the making of Holland. The populace saved Rome more than once, and the rabble followed Jesus Christ. There is no thinker who has not at times contemplated the magnificences of the lower classes. It was of this rabble that Saint Jerome was thinking, no doubt, and of all these poor people and all these vagabonds and all these miserable people whence sprang the apostles and the martyrs when he uttered this mysterious saying, Fex urbis, lex orbis, the dregs of the city, the law of the earth. The exasperations of this crowd which suffers and bleeds, its violences contrary to all sense, directed against the principles which are its life, its masterful deeds against the right, are its popular coup d'etat and should be repressed. The man of probity sacrifices himself, and out of his very love for this crowd he combats it. But how excusable he feels it even while holding out against it, how he venerates it even while resisting it. This is one of those rare moments when, while doing that which it is one's duty to do, one feels something which disconcerts one and which would dissuade one from proceeding further. One persists, it is necessary, but conscience, though satisfied, is sad, and the accomplishment of duty is complicated with a pain at the heart. June 1848, let us hasten to say, was an exceptional fact, and almost impossible of classification in the philosophy of history. All the words which we have just uttered must be discarded when it becomes a question of this extraordinary revolt, in which one feels the holy anxiety of toil claiming its rights. It was necessary to combat it, and this was a duty, for it attacked the Republic. But what was June 1848 at bottom? A revolt of the people against itself. Where the subject is not lost sight of, there is no digression. May we then be permitted to arrest the reader's attention for a moment on the two absolutely unique barricades of which we have just spoken and which characterize this insurrection. One blocked the entrance to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The other defended the approach to the Faubourg du Temple. Those before whom these two fearful masterpieces of civil war reared themselves beneath the brilliant blue sky of June will never forget them. The Saint-Antoine barricade was tremendous. It was 3 stories high and 700 feet wide. It barred the vast opening of the Faubourg, that is to say 3 streets from angle to angle. Ravined, jagged, cut up, divided, crenellated, with an immense rent, buttressed with piles that were bastions in themselves, throwing out capes here and there, powerfully backed up by 2 great promontories of houses of the Faubourg. It reared itself like a cyclopean dike at the end of the formidable place which had seen the 14th of July. 19 barricades were ranged, one behind the other, in the depths of the streets behind this principal barricade. At the very sight of it, one felt the agonizing suffering in the immense Faubourg, which had reached that point of extremity when a distress may become a catastrophe. Of what was that barricade made? Of the ruins of 3 6-story houses demolished expressly, said some. Of the prodigy of all wraths, said others. It wore the lamentable aspect of all constructions of hatred, ruin. It might be asked, who built this? It might also be said, who destroyed this? It was the improvisation of ebullition. Hold! Take this door, this grating, this penthouse, this chimney-piece, this broken brazier, this cracked pot. Give all, cast away all. Push this roll, dig, dismantle, overturn, ruin everything. It was the collaboration of the pavement, the block of stone, the beam, the bar of iron, the rag, the scrap, the broken pane, the unseated chair, the cabbage stalk, the tatter, the rag, and the malediction. It was grand and it was petty. It was the abyss parodied on the public place by hubbub. The mass beside the atom, the strip of ruined wall and the broken bowl, threatening fraternization of every sort of rubbish. Sisyphus had thrown his rock there, and Job his potsherd. Terrible, in short. It was the Acropolis of the barefooted. Overturned carts broke the uniformity of the slope. An immense dray was spread out there crossways, its axle pointed heavenward, and seemed a scar on that tumultuous facade. An omnibus hoisted gaily by main force to the very summit of the heap, as though the architects of this bit of savagery had wished to add a touch of the street urchin humor to their terror, presented its horseless, unharnessed pole to no one knows what horses of the air. This gigantic heap, the alluvium of the revolt, figured to the mind an ossa on pelion of all revolutions. 93 on 89, the 9th of Thermidor on the 10th of August, the 18th of Brumaire on the 11th of January, Vendémiaire on Prairial, 1848 on 1830. The situation deserved the trouble, and this barricade was worthy to figure on the very spot whence the Bastille had disappeared. If the ocean made dikes, it is thus that it would build. The fury of the flood was stamped on this shapeless mass. What flood? The crowd. One thought one beheld hubbub petrified. One thought one heard humming above this barricade as though there had been over their hive enormous dark bees of violent progress. Was it a thicket? Was it a bacchanalia? Was it a fortress? Vertigo seemed to have constructed it with blows of its wings. There was something of the cesspool in that redoubt, and something Olympian in that confusion. One there beheld, in a pell-mell full of despair, the rafters of roofs, bits of garret windows with their figured paper, window sashes with their glass planted there in the ruins awaiting the cannon, wrecks of chimneys, cupboards, tables, benches, howling topsy-turvydom, and those thousands poverty-stricken things, the very refuse of the mendicant, which contain at the same time fury and nothingness. One would have said that it was the tatters of a people, rags of wood, of iron, of bronze, of stone, and that the Faubourg Saint-Antoine had thrust it there at its door with a colossal flourish of the broom making of its misery its barricade. Blocks resembling headsman's blocks, dislocated chains, pieces of woodwork with brackets having the form of gibbets, horizontal wheels projecting from the rubbish, amalgamated with this edifice of anarchy the sombre figure of the old tortures endured by the people. The barricade Saint-Antoine converted everything into a weapon. Everything that civil war could throw at the head of society proceeded thence. It was not combat, it was a paroxysm. The carbines which defended this redoubt, among which there were some blunderbusses, sent bits of earthenware bones, coat buttons, even the casters from nightstands, dangerous projectiles on account of the brass. This barricade was furious. It hurled to the clouds an inexpressible clamor at certain moments when, provoking the army, it was covered with throngs and tempests. A tumultuous crowd of flaming heads crowned it. A swarm filled it. It had a thorny crest of guns, of sabers, of cudgels, of axes, of pikes, and of bayonets. A vast red flag flapped in the wind. Shouts of command, songs of attack, the rolls of drums, the sobs of women, and bursts of gloomy laughter from the starving were to be heard there. It was huge and living, and like the back of an electric beast, there proceeded from it little flashes of lightning. The spirit of revolution covered with its cloud this summit, where rumbled that voice of the people which resembles the voice of God. A strange majesty was emitted by this titanic basket of rubbish. It was a heap of filth, and it was Sinai. As we have said previously, it attacked in the name of the revolution. What? The revolution, that barricade. Chance, hazard, disorder, terror, misunderstanding, the unknown. It had facing it the Constituent Assembly, the sovereignty of the people, universal suffrage, the nation, the republic, and it was the Carmagnole bidding defiance to the Marseillaise. Immense but heroic defiance, for the old Faubourg is a hero. The Faubourg and its redoubt lent each other assistance. The Faubourg shouldered the redoubt. The redoubt took its stand under cover of the Faubourg. The vast barricade spread out like a cliff against which the strategy of the African generals dashed itself. Its caverns, its excrescences, its warts, its gibbosities grimaced, so to speak, and grinned beneath the smoke. The mitraille vanished in shapelessness. The bombs plunged into it. Bullets only succeeded in making holes in it. What was the use of cannonading chaos? And the regiments, accustomed to the fiercest visions of war, gazed with uneasy eyes on that species of redoubt, a wild beast in its boar-like bristling, and a mountain by its enormous size. A quarter of a league away, from the corner of the Rue du Temple, which debouches on the boulevard near the Château d'Eau, if one thrust one's head bodily beyond the point formed by the front of the D'Allemagne shop, one perceived in the distance, beyond the canal, in the street which mounts the slopes of Belleville, at the culminating point of the rise, a strange wall reaching to the second story of the house fronts, a sort of hyphen between the houses on the right and the houses on the left, as though the street had folded back on itself its loftiest wall in order to close itself abruptly. This wall was built of paving stones. It was straight, correct, cold, perpendicular, leveled with the square, laid out by rule and line. Cement was lacking, of course, but as in the case of certain Roman walls, without interfering with its rigid architecture. The entablature was mathematically parallel with the base. From distance to distance, one could distinguish on the gray surface almost invisible loopholes, which resembled black threads. These loopholes were separated from each other by equal spaces. The street was deserted as far as the eye could reach. All windows and doors were closed. In the background rose this barrier which made a blind thoroughfare of the street, a motionless and tranquil wall. No one was visible, nothing was audible, not a cry, not a sound, not a breath, a sepulchre. The dazzling sun of June inundated this terrible thing with light. It was the barricade of the Faubourg of the Temple. As soon as one arrived on the spot and caught sight of it, it was impossible, even for the boldest, not to become thoughtful before this mysterious apparition. It was adjusted, jointed, imbricated, rectilinear, symmetrical, and funereal. Science and gloom met there. One felt that the chief of this barricade was a geometrician or a spectre. One looked at it and spoke low. From time to time, if some soldier, an officer or representative of the people chanced to traverse the deserted highway, a faint sharp whistle was heard, and the passer-by fell dead or wounded, or, if he escaped the bullet, sometimes a Biscayan was seen to ensconce itself in some closed shutter in the interstice between two blocks of stone, or in the plaster of a wall. For the men in the barricade had made themselves two small cannons out of two cast-iron lengths of gas pipe, plugged up at one end with tow and fire clay, and there was no waste of useless powder. Nearly every shot told. There were corpses here and there, and pools of blood on the pavement. I remember a white butterfly which went and came in the street. Summer does not abdicate. In the neighborhood, the spaces beneath the porte cochère were encumbered with wounded. One felt oneself aimed at by some person whom one did not see, and one understood that guns were leveled at the whole length of the street. Massed behind the sort of sloping ridge which the vaulted canal forms at the entrance to the Faubourg du Temple, the soldiers of the attacking column gravely and thoughtfully watched this dismal redoubt, this immobility, this passivity whence sprang death. Some crawled flat on their faces as far as the crest of the curve of the bridge, taking care that their shakos did not project beyond it. The valiant Colonel Montenard admired this barricade with a shudder. "How that is built," he said to a representative. "Not one paving stone projects beyond its neighbor. It is made of porcelain." At that moment, a bullet broke the cross on his breast, and he fell. "The cowards," people said. "Let them show themselves. Let us see them. They dare not. They are hiding." The barricade of the Faubourg du Temple, defended by 80 men, attacked by 10,000, held out for 3 days. On the 4th, they did as at Zacha, as at Constantine. They pierced the houses, they came over the roofs, the barricade was taken. Not one of the 80 cowards thought of flight. All were killed there, with the exception of the leader, Barthélemy, of whom we shall speak presently. The Saint-Antoine barricade was the tumult of thunders. The barricade of the Temple was silence. The difference between these two redoubts was the difference between the formidable and the sinister. One seemed a maw, the other a mask. Admitting that the gigantic and gloomy insurrection of June was composed of a wrath and of an enigma, one divined in the first barricade the dragon, and behind the second the Sphinx. These two fortresses had been erected by two men named, the one Cournet, the other Barthélemy. Cournet made the Saint-Antoine barricade, Barthélemy the barricade of the Temple. Each was the image of the man who had built it. Cournet was a man of lofty stature. He had broad shoulders, a red face, a crushing fist, a bold heart, a loyal soul, a sincere and terrible eye. Intrepid, energetic, irascible, stormy, the most cordial of men, the most formidable of combatants. War, strife, conflict were the very air he breathed, and put him in a good humor. He had been an officer in the Navy, and from his gestures and his voice one divined that he sprang from the ocean, and that he came from the tempest. He carried the hurricane on into battle. With the exception of the genius, there was in Cournet something of Danton, as with the exception of the divinity, there was in Danton something of Hercules. Barthélemy, thin, feeble, pale, taciturn, was a sort of tragic street urchin who, having had his ears boxed by a policeman, lay in wait for him and killed him, and at 17 was sent to the galleys. He came out and made this barricade. Later on, fatal circumstance in London proscribed by all, Barthélemy slew Cournet. It was a funereal duel. Some time afterwards, caught in the gearing of one of those mysterious adventures in which passion plays a part, a catastrophe in which French justice sees extenuating circumstances, and in which English justice sees only death, Barthélemy was hanged. The somber social construction is so made that, thanks to material destitution, thanks to moral obscurity, that unhappy being who possessed an intelligence certainly firm, possibly great, began in France with the galleys and ended in England with the gallows. Barthélemy, on occasion, flew one flag, the black flag. End of Book 1, Chapter 1. Chapters 2 and 3 of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hapgood. Book the First. The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 2. What is to be done in the abyss if one does not converse? 16 years count in the subterranean education of insurrection, and June 1848 knew a great deal more about it than June 1832. So the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie was only an outline, and an embryo compared to the two colossal barricades which we have just sketched, but it was formidable for that epoch. The insurgents, under the eye of Enjolras, for Marius no longer looked after anything, had made good use of the night. The barricade had been not only repaired, but augmented. They had raised it 2 feet. Bars of iron planted in the pavement resembled lances in rest. All sorts of rubbish brought and added from all directions complicated the external confusion. The redoubt had been cleverly made over into a wall on the inside and a thicket on the outside. The staircase of paving stones, which permitted one to mount it like the wall of a citadel, had been reconstructed. The barricade had been put in order, the tap room disencumbered, the kitchen appropriated for the ambulance, the dressing of the wounded completed, the powder scattered on the ground and on the tables had been gathered up, bullets run, cartridges manufactured, lint scraped, the fallen weapons redistributed, the interior of the redoubt cleaned, the rubbish swept up, corpses removed. They laid the dead in a heap in the Mondétour lane, of which they were still the masters. The pavement was red for a long time at that spot. Among the dead there were 4 National Guardsmen of the suburbs. Enjolras had their uniforms laid aside. Enjolras had advised 2 hours of sleep. Advice from Enjolras was a command. Still, only 3 or 4 took advantage of it. Feuilly employed those 2 hours in engraving this inscription on the wall which faced the tavern: "Long live the peoples!" These 4 words, hollowed out in the rough stone with a nail, could be still read on the wall in 1848. The 3 women had profited by the respite of the night to vanish definitely, which allowed the insurgents to breathe more freely. They had found means of taking refuge in some neighboring house. The greater part of the wounded were able and wished to fight still. On a litter of mattresses and trusses of straw in the kitchen, which had been converted into an ambulance, there were 5 men gravely wounded, 2 of whom were municipal guardsmen. The municipal guardsmen were attended to first. In the tap room there remained only Mabeuf under his black cloth and Javert bound to his post. "This is the hall of the dead," said Enjolras. In the interior of this hall, barely lighted by a candle at one end, the mortuary table being behind the post like a horizontal bar, a sort of vast, vague cross resulted from Javert erect and Mabeuf lying prone. The pole of the omnibus, although snapped off by the fusillade, was still sufficiently upright to admit of their fastening the flag to it. Enjolras, who possessed that quality of a leader of always doing what he said, attached to this staff the bullet-ridden and the bloody coat of the old man's. No repast had been possible. There was neither bread nor meat. The 50 men in the barricade had speedily exhausted the scanty provisions of the wine shop during the 16 hours which they had passed there. At a given moment, every barricade inevitably becomes the raft of the Méduse. They were obliged to resign themselves to hunger. They had then reached the first hours of that Spartan day of the 6th of June, when in the barricade Saint-Merry, Jeanne, surrounded by the insurgents who demanded bread, replied to all combatants, crying, "Something to eat?" with, "Why? It is 3 o'clock. At 4 o'clock we shall be dead." As they could no longer eat, Enjolras forbade them to drink. He interdicted wine and portioned out the brandy. They had found in the cellar 15 full bottles hermetically sealed. Enjolras and Combeferre examined them. Combeferre, when he came up again, said, "It's the old stock of Father Hucheloup, who began business as a grocer." "It must be real wine," observed Bossuet. "It's lucky that Grantaire is asleep. If he were on foot, there would be a good deal of difficulty in saving these bottles." Enjolras, in spite of all murmurs, placed his veto on the 15 bottles, and in order that no one might touch them, he had them placed under the table on which Father Mabeuf was lying. About 2 o'clock in the morning, they reckoned up their strength. There were still 37 of them. The day began to dawn. The torch, which had been replaced in its cavity in the pavement, had just been extinguished. The interior of the barricade, that species of tiny courtyard appropriated from the street, was bathed in shadows, and resembled, athwart the vague twilight horror, the deck of a disabled ship. The combatants, as they went and came, moved about there like black forms. Above that terrible nesting place of doom and gloom, the stories of the mute houses were lividly outlined. At the very top, the chimney stood palely out. The sky was of that charming, undecided hue which may be white and may be blue. Birds flew about in it with cries of joy. The lofty house which formed the back of the barricade, being turned to the east, had upon its roof a rosy reflection. The morning breeze ruffled the gray hair on the head of the dead man at the 3rd-story window. I am delighted that the torch has been extinguished, said Courfeyrac to Feuilly. That torch flickering in the wind annoyed me. It had the appearance of being afraid. The light of torches resembles the wisdom of cowards. It gives a bad light because it trembles. Dawn awakens minds as it does the birds. All began to talk. Joly, perceiving a cat prowling on a gutter, extracted philosophy from it. "What is the cat?" he exclaimed. "It is a corrective. The good God, having made the mouse, said, 'Hello, I have committed a blunder.' And so he made the cat. The cat is the erratum of the mouse. The mouse plus the cat is the proof of creation revised and corrected." Combeferre, surrounded by students and artisans, was speaking of the dead, of Jean Prouvaire, of Bahorel, of Mabeuf, and even of Cabuc, and of Enjolras' sad severity. He said, "Harmodius and Aristogiton, Brutus, Chereas, Stephanus, Cromwell, Charlotte Corday, Sand have all had their moment of agony when it was too late. Our hearts quiver so, and human life is such a mystery that even in the case of a civic murder, even in a murder for liberation, if there be such a thing, the remorse for having struck a man surpasses the joy of having served the human race." And such are the windings of the exchange of speech, that a moment later, by a transition brought about through Jean Prouvaire's verses, Combeferre was comparing the translators of the Georgics, Rau with Cournant, Cournant with Delille, pointing out the passages translated by Malfilâtre, particularly the prodigies of Caesar's death, and at that word, Caesar, the conversation reverted to Brutus. "Caesar," said Combeferre, "fell justly. Cicero was severe towards Caesar, and he was right. That severity is not diatribe. When Zoilus insults Homer, when Maevius insults Virgil, when Vyse insults Molière, when Pope insults Shakespeare, when Frederick insults Voltaire, it is an old law of envy and hatred which is being carried out. Genius attracts insult. Great men are always more or less barked at. But Zoilus and Cicero are two different persons. Cicero is an arbiter in thought, just as Brutus is an arbiter by the sword. For my part, I blame that last justice, the blade. But antiquity admitted it. Caesar, the violator of the Rubicon, conferring as though they came from him, the dignities which emanated from the people, not rising at the entrance of the Senate, committed the acts of a king and almost of a tyrant. Regia ac pene tyrannica. He was a great man, so much the worse, or so much the better. The lesson is but the more exalted. His 23 wounds touch me less than the spitting in the face of Jesus Christ. Caesar is stabbed by the senators. Christ is cuffed by lackeys. One feels the God through the greater outrage. Bossuet, who towered above the interlocutors from the summit of a heap of paving stones, exclaimed, rifle in hand, "O Cydithenium! O Myrrhinus! O Probalinthus! O graces of the Iantides! Oh, who will grant me to pronounce the verses of Homer like a Greek of Laurium or of Adeption?" Chapter 3. Light and Shadow. Enjolras had been to make a reconnaissance. He had made his way out through Mondétour Lane, gliding along close to the houses. The insurgents, we will remark, were full of hope. The manner in which they had repulsed the attack of the preceding night had caused them to almost disdain in advance the attack at dawn. They waited for it with a smile. They had no more doubt as to their success than as to their cause. Moreover, succor was evidently on the way to them. They reckoned on it. With that facility of triumphant prophecy which is one of the sources of strength in the French combatant, they divided the day which was at hand into three distinct phases. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a regiment which had been labored with, quote unquote, would turn. At noon, the insurrection of all Paris. At sunset, revolution. They heard the alarm bell of Saint-Merry, which had not been silent for an instant since the night before, a proof that the other barricade, the great one, Jeanne's, still held out. All these hopes were exchanged between the different groups in a sort of gay and formidable whisper, which resembled the warlike hum of a hive of bees. Enjolras reappeared. He returned from his somber eagle flight into outer darkness. He listened for a moment to all this joy with folded arms and one hand on his mouth. Then, fresh and rosy in the growing whiteness of the dawn, he said, "The whole army of Paris is to strike. A third of the army is bearing down upon the barricades in which you now are. There is the National Guard in addition. I have picked out the shakos of the 5th of the line and the standard bearers of the 6th Legion. In 1 hour you will be attacked. As for the populace, it was seething yesterday. Today it is not stirring. There is nothing to expect, nothing to hope for, neither from a faubourg nor from a regiment. You are abandoned." These words fell upon the buzzing of the groups and produced on them the effect caused on a swarm of bees by the first drops of a storm. A moment of indescribable silence ensued, in which death might have been heard flitting by. This moment was brief. A voice from the obscurest depths of the groups shouted to Enjolras, "So be it! Let us raise the barricade to a height of 20 feet, and let us all remain in it. Citizens, let us offer the protests of corpses. Let us show that if the people abandon the Republicans do not abandon the people." These words freed the thought of all from the painful cloud of individual anxieties. It was hailed with an enthusiastic acclamation. No one ever has known the name of the man who spoke thus. He was some unknown blouse wearer, a stranger, a man forgotten, a passing hero, that great anonymous, always mingled in human crises and in social geniuses, who, at a given moment, utters in a supreme fashion the decisive word, and who vanishes into the shadows after having represented for a minute in a lightning flash the people and God. This inexorable resolution so thoroughly impregnated the air of the 6th of June, 1832, that almost at the very same hour, on the barricade Saint-Merry, the insurgents were raising that clamor which has become a matter of history and which has been consigned to the documents in the case. Quote unquote, "What matters it whether they come to our assistance or not? Let us get ourselves killed here to the very last man." As the reader sees, the two barricades, though materially isolated, were in communication with each other. End of Book 1, Chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 4 of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hapgood. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 4. -5 + 1. After the man who decreed the quote-unquote protest of corpses had spoken and had given this formula of their common soul, there issued from all mouths a strangely satisfied and terrible cry, funereal in a sense, and triumphant in tone. "Long live death! Let us all remain here." "Why all?" said Enjolras. "All, all!" Enjolras resumed. "The position is good, the barricade is fine, 30 men are enough, why sacrifice 40?" They replied, "Because not one will go away." "Citizens!" cried Enjolras, and there was an almost irritated vibration in his voice, "this republic is not rich enough in men to indulge in useless expenditure of them. Vainglory is waste. If the duty of some is to depart, that duty should be fulfilled like any other." Enjolras, the man principal, had over his co-religionists that sort of omnipotent power which emanates from the absolute. Still, great as was this omnipotence, a murmur arose. A leader to the very fingertips, Enjolras, seeing that they murmured, insisted. He resumed haughtily, "Let those who are afraid of not numbering more than 30 say so." The murmurs redoubled. "Besides," observed a voice in one group, "it is easy enough to talk about leaving. The barricade is hemmed in." "Not on the side of Les Halles," said Enjolras. "The Rue Mondétour is free, and through the Rue des Prêcheurs one can reach the Marche des Innocents." "And there," went on another voice, "you would be captured. You would fall in with some grand guard of the line or the suburbs. They will spy a man passing in blouse and cape. 'Whence come you? Don't you belong to the barricade?' And they will look at your hands. 'You smell of powder, shot.'" Enjolras, without making any reply, touched Combeferre's shoulder, and the two entered the tap room. They emerged thence a moment later. Enjolras held in his outstretched hands the 4 uniforms which he had laid aside. Combeferre followed, carrying the shoulder belts and the shakoes. "With this uniform," said Enjolras, "you can mingle with the ranks and escape. Here is enough for 4." And he flung on the ground, deprived of its pavement, the 4 uniforms. No wavering took place in his stoical audience. Combeferre took the word. "Come," said he, "you must have a little pity. Do you know what the question is here? It is a question of women. See here. Are there women or are there not? Are there children or are there not? Are there mothers, yes or no, who rock cradles with their foot and who have a lot of little ones around them? Let that man of you who has never beheld a nurse's breast raise his hand. Ah, you want to get yourselves killed? So do I who am speaking to you. But I do not want to feel the phantoms of women wreathing their arms around me. Die if you will, but don't make others die. Suicides like that which is on the brink of accomplishment here are sublime, but suicide is narrow and does not admit of extension, and as soon as it touches your neighbors, suicide is murder. Think of the little blonde heads, think of the white locks. Listen, Enjolras has just told me that he saw at the corner of the Rue du Cygne a lighted casement, a candle in a poor window on the 5th floor, and on the pane the quivering shadow of the head of an old woman who had the air of having spent the night in watching. Perhaps she is the mother of some one of you. Well, let that man go and make haste to say to his mother, 'Here I am, mother.' Let him feel at ease, the task here will be performed all the same. When one supports one's relatives by one's toil, one has not the right to sacrifice oneself. That is deserting one's family. And those who have daughters, what are you thinking of? You get yourselves killed, you are dead, that is well. And tomorrow? Young girls without bread, that is a terrible thing. Man begs, women sells. Ah, those charming and gracious beings, so gracious and so sweet, who have bonnets of flowers, who fill the house with purity, who sing and prattle, who are like a living perfume, who prove the existence of angels in heaven by the purity of virgins on earth. That Jeanne, that Lise, that Mimi, those adorable and honest creatures who are your blessings and your pride, ah, good God, they will suffer hunger. What do you want me to say to you? There is a market for human flesh, and it is not with your shadowy hands shuddering around them that you will prevent them from entering it. Think of the street. Think of the pavement covered with passers-by. Think of the shops past which women go and come with necks all bare and through the mire. These women, too, were pure once. Think of your sisters, those of you who have them. Misery, prostitution, the police, Saint-Lazare. That is what those beautiful, delicate girls, those fragile marvels of modesty, gentleness, and loveliness, fresher than lilacs in the month of May, will come to. Ah, you have got yourselves killed. You are no longer on hand. That is well. You have wished to release the people from royalty, and you deliver over your daughters to the police. Friends, have a care, have mercy. Women, unhappy women, we are not in the habit of bestowing much thought on them. We trust to the women not having received a man's education. We prevent their reading, we prevent their thinking, we prevent their occupying themselves with politics. Will you prevent them from going to the dead house this evening and recognizing your bodies? Let us see, those who have families must be tractable, and shake hands with us and take themselves off, and leave us here alone to tend to this affair. I know well that courage is required to leave, that it is hard. But the harder it is, the more meritorious. You say, I have a gun, I am at the barricades, so much the worse, I shall remain there. So much the worse is easily said. My friends, there is a morrow. You will not be here tomorrow, but your families will. And what sufferings! See, here is a pretty, healthy child, with cheeks like an apple, who babbles, prattles, chatters, who laughs, who smells sweet beneath your kiss. And do you know what becomes of him when he is abandoned? I have seen one, a very small creature, no taller than that. His father was dead. Poor people had taken him in out of charity, but they had bread only for themselves. The child was always hungry. It was winter. He did not cry. You could see him approach the stove, in which there was never any fire, and whose pipe, you know, was of mastic and yellow clay. His breathing was hoarse, his face livid, his limbs flaccid, his belly prominent. He said nothing. If you spoke to him, he did not answer. He is dead. He was taken to the Necker hospital, where I saw him. I was house surgeon in that hospital. Now, if there are any fathers among you, fathers whose happiness it is to stroll on Sundays holding their child's tiny hand in their robust hand, let each one of those fathers imagine that this child is his own. That poor brat I remember, and I seem to see him now when he lay nude on the dissecting table, how his ribs stood out on his skin like the graves beneath the grass in a cemetery. A sort of mud was found in his stomach. There were ashes in his teeth. Come, let us examine ourselves conscientiously and take counsel with our heart. Statistics show that the mortality among abandoned children is 55%. I repeat, it is a question of women. It concerns mothers, it concerns young girls, it concerns little children. Who is talking to you of yourselves? We know well what you are. We know well that you are all brave, parbleu. We know well that you all have in your souls the joy and the glory of giving your life for the great cause. We know well that you feel yourselves elected to die usefully and magnificently, and that each one of you clings to his share in the triumph. Very well, but you are not alone in this world. There are other beings of whom you must think. You must not be egoists. All dropped their heads with a gloomy air. Strange contradictions of the human heart at its most sublime moments. Combeferre, who spoke thus, was not an orphan. He recalled the mothers of other men and forgot his own. He was about to get himself killed. He was an egoist. Marius, fasting, fevered, having emerged in succession from all hope, and having been stranded in grief, the most sombre of shipwrecks, and saturated with violent emotions and conscious that the end was near, had plunged deeper and deeper into that visionary stupor which always precedes the fatal hour voluntarily accepted. A physiologist might have studied in him the growing symptoms of that febrile absorption known to and classified by science, and which is to suffering what voluptuousness is to pleasure. Despair also has its ecstasy. Marius had reached this point. He looked on at everything as from without. As we have said, things which passed before him seemed far away. He made out the whole, but did not perceive the details. He beheld men going and coming as through a flame. He heard voices speaking as at the bottom of an abyss. But this moved him. There was in this scene a point which pierced and roused even him. He had but one idea now, to die, and he did not wish to be turned aside from it, but he reflected, in his gloomy somnambulism, that while destroying himself, he was not prohibited from saving someone else. He raised his voice. Enjolras and Combeferre are right, he said. No unnecessary sacrifice. I join them, and you must make haste. Combeferre has said convincing things to you. There are some among you who have families, mothers, sisters, wives, children. Let such leave the ranks. No one stirred. Married men and the supporters of families step out of the ranks, repeated Marius. His authority was great. Enjolras was certainly the head of the barricade, but Marius was its savior. I order it, cried Enjolras. I entreat you, said Marius. Then, touched by Combeferre's words, shaken by Enjolras' order, touched by Marius's entreaty, these heroic men began to denounce each other. It is true, said one man to a full-grown man, you are the father of a family. Go. It is your duty, rather, retorted the man. You have 2 sisters whom you maintain. And an unprecedented controversy broke forth. Each struggled to determine which should not allow himself to be placed at the door of the tomb. Make haste, said Courfeyrac. In another quarter of an hour it will be too late. Citizens, pursued Enjolras, this is the Republic, and universal suffrage reigns. Do you yourselves designate those who are to go? They obeyed. After the expiration of a few minutes, 5 were unanimously selected and stepped out of the ranks. There are 5 of them, exclaimed Marius. There were only 4 uniforms. Well, began the 5, one must stay behind. And then a struggle arose as to who should remain and who should find reasons for the others not remaining. The generous quarrel began afresh. You have a wife who loves you. You have your aged mother. You have neither father nor mother, and what is to become of your 3 little brothers? You are the father of 5 children. You have a right to live. You are only 17. It is too early for you to die. These great revolutionary barricades were assembling points for heroism. The improbable was simple there. These men did not astonish each other. Be quick, repeated Courfeyrac. Men shouted to Marius from the groups, do you designate who is to remain? Yes, said the 5, choose, we will obey you. Marius did not believe that he was capable of another emotion. Still, at this idea, that of choosing a man for death, his blood rushed back to his heart. He would have turned pale had it been possible for him to become any paler. He advanced towards the five, who smiled upon him, and each with his eyes full of that grand flame which one beholds in the depths of history hovering over Thermopylae, cried to him, "Me, me, me!" And Marius stupidly counted them. There were still 5 of them. Then his glance dropped to the 4 uniforms. At that moment, a 5th uniform fell, as if from heaven, upon the other 4. The 5th man was saved. Marius raised his eyes and recognized Monsieur Fauchelevent. Jean Valjean had just entered the barricade. He had arrived by way of Mondétour lane, whither by dint of inquiries made, or by instinct, or by chance. Thanks to his dress of a National Guardsman, he had made his way without difficulty. The sentinel stationed by the insurgents in the Rue Mondétour had no occasion to give the alarm for a single National Guardsman, and he had allowed the latter to entangle himself in the street, saying to himself, "Probably it is a reinforcement. In any case, it is a prisoner." The moment was too grave to admit of the sentinel abandoning his duty and his post of observation. At the moment when Jean Valjean entered the redoubt, no one had noticed him, all eyes being fixed on the 5 chosen men and the 4 uniforms. Jean Valjean also had seen and heard, and he had silently removed his coat and flung it on the pile with the rest. The emotion aroused was indescribable. "Who is this man?" demanded Bossuet. "He is a man who saves others," replied Combeferre. Marius added in a grave voice, "I know him." This guarantee satisfied every one. Enjolras turned to Jean Valjean. "Welcome, citizen." And he added, "You know that we are about to die." Jean Valjean, without replying, helped the insurgent whom he was saving to don his uniform. End of Book 1, Chapter 4. Chapters 5 and 6 of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hepgood. Book the First, The War Between 4 Walls. Chapter 5, The Horizon Which One Beholds from the Summit of a Barricade. The situation of all in that fatal hour and that pitiless place had as result and culminating point Enjolras' supreme melancholy. Enjolras bore within him the plenitude of the revolution. He was incomplete, however, so far as the absolute can be so. He had too much of Saint-Just about him, and not enough of Anacharsis Clootz. Still, his mind, in the society of the friends of the ABC, had ended by undergoing a certain polarization from Combeferre's ideas. For some time past he had been gradually emerging from the narrow form of dogma, and had allowed himself to incline to the broadening influence of progress, and he had come to accept as a definitive and magnificent evolution the transformation of the great French Republic into the immense human republic. As far as the immediate means were concerned, a violent situation being given, he wished to be violent. On that point he never varied, and he remained of that epic and redoubtable school which is summed up in the words 83. Enjolras was standing erect on the staircase of paving stones, one elbow resting on the stock of his gun. He was engaged in thought. He quivered as at the passage of prophetic breaths. Places where death is have these effects of tripods. A sort of stifled fire darted from his eyes, which were filled with an inward look. All at once he threw back his head, his blonde locks fell back like those of an angel on the sombre quadriga made of stars, They were like the mane of a startled lion in the flaming of an halo, and Enjolras cried, "Citizens, do you picture the future to yourselves? The streets of cities inundated with light, green branches on the thresholds, nations sisters, men just, old men blessing children, the past loving the present, thinkers entirely at liberty, believers on terms of full equality. For religion, heaven, God the direct priest, human conscience become an altar. No more hatreds, the fraternity of the workshop and the school. For soul penalty and recompense fame, work for all, right for all, peace over all, no more bloodshed, no more wars, happy mothers. To conquer matter is the first step. To realize the ideal is the second. Reflect on what progress has already accomplished. Formerly, the first human races beheld with terror the hydra pass before their eyes, breathing on the waters, the dragon which vomited flame, the griffin who was the monster of the air, and who flew with the wings of an eagle and the talons of a tiger. Fearful beasts which were above man. Man nevertheless spread his snares, consecrated by intelligence, and finally conquered these monsters. We have vanquished the hydra, and it is called the locomotive. We are on the point of vanquishing the griffin. We already grasp it, and it is called the balloon. On the day when this Promethean task shall be accomplished, and when man shall have definitely harnessed to his will the triple chimera of antiquity, the hydra, the dragon, and the griffin, he will be the master of water, fire, and of air. He will be for the rest of animated creation that which the ancient gods formerly were to him. Courage and onward! Citizens, whither are we going? To science-made government, to the force of things become the sole public force, to the natural law having in itself its sanction and its penalty and promulgating itself by evidence, to a dawn of truth corresponding to a dawn of day. We are advancing to the union of peoples. We are advancing to the unity of man. No more fictions, no more parasites. The real governed by the true. That is the goal. Civilization will hold its assizes at the summit of Europe, and later on at the center of continents, in a grand parliament of the intelligence. Something similar has already been seen. The Amphictyons had 2 sittings a year, one at Delphos, the seat of the gods, and the other at Thermopylae, the place of heroes. Europe will have her Amphictyons. The globe will have its Amphictyons. France bears this sublime future in her breast. This is the gestation of the 19th century. That which Greece sketched out is worthy of being finished by France. Listen to me, you, Feuilly, valiant artisan, man of the Republic. I revere you. Yes, you clearly behold the future. Yes, you are right. You had neither father nor mother. Feuilly, you adopted humanity for your mother and right for your father. You are about to die, that is to say, to triumph here. Citizens, whatever happens today through our defeat as well as through our victory, it is a revolution that we are about to create. As conflagrations light up a whole city, so revolutions illuminate the whole human race. And what is the revolution that we shall cause? We have just told you, the revolution of the true. From a political point of view, there is but a single principle, the sovereignty of man over himself. This sovereignty of myself over myself is called liberty. Where 2 or 3 of these sovereignties are combined, the state begins. But in that association there is no abdication. Each sovereignty concedes a certain quantity of itself for the purpose of forming the common right. This quantity is the same for all of us. This identity of concession which each makes to all is called equality. Common right is nothing else than the protection of all beaming on the right of each. This protection of all over each is called fraternity. The point of intersection of all these assembled sovereignties is called society. This intersection being a junction, this point is a knot, hence what is called the social bond. Some say social contract, which is the same thing, the word contract being etymologically formed with the idea of a bond. Let us come to an understanding about equality, for if liberty is the summit, equality is the base. Equality, citizens, is not wholly a surface vegetation, a society of great blades of grass and tiny oaks, a proximity of jealousies which render each other null and void. Legally speaking, it is all aptitudes possessed of the same opportunity. Politically, it is all votes possessed of the same weight. Religiously, it is all consciences possessed of the same right. Equality has an organ, gratuitous and obligatory instruction. The right to the alphabet, that is where the beginning must be made. The primary school imposed on all, the secondary school offered to all, that is the law. From an identical school, an identical society will spring. Yes, instruction, light, light, everything comes from light, and to it everything returns. Citizens, the 19th century is great, but the 20th century will be happy. Then there will be nothing more like the history of old. We shall no longer, as today, have to fear a conquest, an invasion, an usurpation, a rivalry of nations, arms in hand, an interruption of civilization depending on a marriage of kings, on a birth in hereditary tyrannies, a partition of peoples by a congress, a dismemberment because of the failure of a dynasty, a combat of two religions meeting face to face like two bucks in the dark on the bridge of the infinite. We shall no longer have to fear famine, farming out, prostitution arising from distress, misery from the failure of work, and the scaffold and the sword and battles and the ruffianism of chance in the forest of events. One might almost say there will be no more events. We shall be happy. The human race will accomplish its law as the terrestrial globe accomplishes its law. Harmony will be reestablished between the soul and the star. The soul will gravitate around the truth as the planet around the light. Friends, the present hour in which I am addressing you is a gloomy hour. But these are terrible purchases of the future. A revolution is a toll. Oh, the human race will be delivered, raised up, consoled. We affirm it on this barrier. Whence should proceed that cry of love, if not from the heights of sacrifice? Oh, my brothers, this is the point of junction, of those who think and of those who suffer. This barricade is not made of paving stones, nor of joists, nor of bits of iron. It is made of two heaps, a heap of ideas and a heap of woes. Here misery meets the ideal. The day embraces the night and says to it, I am about to die, and thou shalt be born again with me. From the embrace of all desolations, faith leaps forth. Sufferings bring hither their agony, and ideas their immortality. This agony and this immortality are about to join and constitute our death. Brothers, he who dies here dies in the radiance of the future, and we are entering a tomb all flooded with the dawn. Enjolras paused rather than became silent. His lips continued to move silently as though he were talking to himself, which caused them all to gaze attentively at him in the endeavor to hear more. There was no applause, but they whispered together for a long time. Speech being a breath, the rustling of intelligences resembles the rustling of leaves. Chapter 6. Marius haggard, Javert laconic. Let us narrate what was passing in Marius's thoughts. Let the reader recall the state of his soul. We have just recalled it. Everything was a vision to him now. His judgment was disturbed. Marius, let us insist on this point, was under the shadow of the great dark wings which are spread over those in the death agony. He felt that he had entered the tomb. It seemed to him that he was already on the other side of the wall, and he no longer beheld the faces of the living except with the eyes of one dead. How did Monsieur Fauchelevent come there? Why was he there? What had he come there to do? Marius did not address all these questions to himself. Besides, since our despair has this peculiarity that it envelops others as well as ourselves, it seemed logical to him that all the world should come thither to die. Only, he thought of Cosette with a pang at his heart. However, Monsieur Fauchelevent did not speak to him, did not look at him, and had not even the air of hearing him, when Marius raised his voice to say, "I know him." As far as Marius was concerned, this attitude of Monsieur Fauchelevent was comforting, and if such a word can be used for such impressions, we should say that it pleased him. He had always felt the absolute impossibility of addressing that enigmatical man who was, in his eyes, both equivocal and imposing. Moreover, it had been a long time since he had seen him, and this still further augmented the impossibility for Marius's timid and reserved nature. The 5 chosen men left the barricade by way of Mondétour lane. They bore a perfect resemblance to members of the National Guard. One of them wept as he took his leave. Before setting out, they embraced those who remained. When the 5 men sent back to life had taken their departure, Enjolras thought of the man who had been condemned to death. He entered the tap-room. Javert, still bound to the post, was engaged in meditation. "Do you want anything?" Enjolras asked him. Javert replied, "When are you going to kill me?" "Wait. We need all our cartridges just at present." "Then give me a drink," said Javert. Enjolras himself offered him a glass of water, and as Javert was pinioned, he helped him to drink. "Is that all?" inquired Enjolras. "I am uncomfortable against this post," replied Javert. "You are not tender to have left me to pass the night here. Bind me as you please, but you surely might lay me out on a table like that other man." And with a motion of the head, he indicated the body of Monsieur Mabeuf. There was, as the reader will remember, a long, broad table at the end of the room on which they had been running bullets and making cartridges. All the cartridges having been made and all the powder used, this table was free. At Enjolras' command, 4 insurgents unbound Javert from the post. While they were loosing him, a 5th held a bayonet against his breast. Leaving his arms tied behind his back, they placed about his feet a slender but stout whipcord, as is done to men on the point of mounting the scaffold, which allowed him to take steps about 15 inches in length, and made him walk to the table at the end of the room, where they laid him down, closely bound about the middle of the body. By way of further security, and by means of a rope fastened to his neck, they added to the system of ligatures which rendered every attempt at escape impossible, that sort of bond which is called in prisons a martingale, which, starting at the neck, forks on the stomach and meets the hands after passing between the legs. While they were binding Javert, a man standing on the threshold was surveying him with singular attention. The shadow cast by this man made Javert turn his head. He raised his eyes and recognized Jean Valjean. He did not even start, but dropped his lids proudly and confined himself to the remark, "It is perfectly simple." End of Book 1, Chapters 5 and 6. 1. Chapters 7 and 8. Les Miserables, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hapgood. Book the First, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 7. The situation becomes aggravated. The daylight was increasing rapidly. Not a window was opened, not a door stood ajar. It was the dawn, but not the awaking. The end of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, opposite the barricade, had been evacuated by the troops, as we have stated it seemed to be free, and presented itself to passers-by with a sinister tranquility. The Rue Saint-Denis was as dumb as the avenue of the Sphinx at Thebes. Not a living being in the crossroads, which gleamed white in the light of the sun. Nothing is so mournful as this light in deserted streets. Nothing was to be seen, but there was something to be heard. A mysterious movement was going on at a certain distance. It was evident that the critical moment was approaching. As on the previous evening, the sentinels had come in, but this time all had come. The barricade was stronger than on the occasion of the first attack. Since the departure of the five, they had increased its height still further. On the advice of the sentinel, who had examined the region of Les Halles, Enjolras, for fear of a surprise in the rear, came to a serious decision. He had the small gut of the Mondétour lane, which had been left open up to that time, barricaded. For this purpose they tore up the pavement for the length of several houses more. In this manner the barricade, walled on 3 streets, in front on the Rue de la Chanvrerie, to the left on the Rue du Cygne and de la Petite Truanderie, and to the right on the Rue Mondétour, was really almost impregnable. It is true that they were fatally hemmed in there. It had 3 fronts, but no exit. A fortress, but a rat hole too, said Courfeyrac with a laugh. Enjolras had about 30 paving stones torn up in excess, said Bossuet, piled up near the door of the wine shop. The silence was now so profound in the quarter whence the attack must needs come, that Enjolras had each man resume his post of battle. An allowance of brandy was doled out to each. Nothing is more curious than a barricade preparing for an assault. Each man selects his place as though at the theater. They jostle and elbow and crowd each other. There are some who make stalls of paving stones. Here is a corner of the wall which is in the way, it is removed. Here is a redan which may afford protection, they take shelter behind it. Left-handed men are precious, they take the places that are inconvenient to the rest. Many arrange to fight in a sitting posture. They wish to be at ease to kill and to die comfortably. In the sad war of June 1848, an insurgent who was a formidable marksman and who was firing from the top of a terrace upon a roof had a reclining chair brought there for his use. A charge of grape shot found him out there. As soon as the leader has given the order to clear the decks for action, all disorderly movements cease. There is no more pulling from one another, there are no more coteries, no more asides, there is no more holding aloof. Everything in their spirits converges in and changes into a waiting for the assailants. A barricade before the arrival of danger is chaos. In danger, it is discipline itself. Peril produces order. As soon as Enjolras had seized his double-barreled rifle and had placed himself in a sort of embrasure which he had reserved for himself, all the rest held their peace.
A series of faint, sharp noises resounded confusedly along the wall of paving stones. It was the men cocking their guns. Moreover, their attitudes were prouder, more confident than ever. The excess of sacrifice strengthens. They no longer cherished any hope, but they had despair, the last weapon which sometimes gives victory. Virgil has said so. Supreme resources spring from extreme resolutions. To embark in death is sometimes the means of escaping a shipwreck, and the lid of the coffin becomes a plank of safety. As on the preceding evening, the attention of all was directed, we might almost say, leaned upon the end of the street, now lighted up and visible. They had not long to wait. A stir began distinctly in the Saint-Leu quarter, but it did not resemble the movement of the first attack. A clashing of chains, the uneasy jolting of a mass, the click of brass skipping along the pavement, a sort of solemn uproar announced that some sinister construction of iron was approaching. There arose a tremor in the bosoms of these peaceful old streets, pierced and built for the fertile circulation of interests and ideas, and which are not made for the horrible rumble of the wheels of war. The fixity of eye in all the combatants upon the extremity of the street became ferocious. A cannon made its appearance. Artillerymen were pushing the piece. It was in firing trim. The forecarriage had been detached. 2 upheld the gun carriage, 4 were at the wheels, others followed with the caisson. They could see the smoke of the burning lintstock. "Fire!" shouted Enjolras. The whole barricade fired. The report was terrible. An avalanche of smoke covered and effaced both cannon and men. After a few seconds the cloud dispersed, and the cannon and men reappeared. The gun crew had just finished rolling it slowly, correctly, without haste, into position facing the barricade. Not one of them had been struck. Then the captain of the piece, bearing down upon the breach in order to raise the muzzle, began to point the cannon with the gravity of an astronomer leveling a telescope. "Bravo for the cannoneers!" cried Bossuet, and the whole barricade clapped their hands. A moment later, squarely planted in the very middle of the street, astride of the gutter, the piece was ready for action. A formidable pair of jaws yawned on the barricade. "Come merrily now," ejaculated Courfeyrac. "That's the brutal part of it. After the fillip on the nose, the blow from the fist. The army is reaching out its big paw to us. The barricade is going to be severely shaken up. The fusillade tries, the cannon takes." "It is a piece of 8, new model, brass," added Combeferre. "Those pieces are liable to burst as soon as the proportion of 10 parts of tin to 100 of brass is exceeded. The excess of tin renders them too tender. Then it comes to pass that they have caves and chambers when looked at from the vent hole. In order to obviate this danger and to render it possible to force the charge, it may become necessary to return to the process of the 14th century, hooping, and to encircle the piece on the outside with a series of unwelded steel bands, from the breech to the trunnions. In the meantime, they remedy this defect as best they may. They manage to discover where the holes are located in the vent of a cannon by means of a searcher. But there is a better method, with Gribeauval's movable star. In the 16th century, remarked Bossuet, they used to rifle cannon. "Yes," replied Combeferre, "that augments the projectile force, but diminishes the accuracy of the firing. In firing at short range, the trajectory is not as rigid as could be desired. The parabola is exaggerated. The line of the projectile is no longer sufficiently rectilinear to allow of its striking intervening objects, which is, nevertheless, a necessity of battle, the importance of which increases with the proximity of the enemy and the precipitation of the discharge. This defect of the tension of the curve of the projectile in the rifled cannon of the 16th century arose from the smallness of the charge. Small charges for that sort of engine are imposed by the ballistic necessities, such, for instance, as the preservation of the gun carriage. In short, that despot, the cannon, cannot do all that it desires. Force is a great weakness. A cannon ball only travels 600 leagues an hour. Light travels 70,000 leagues a second. Such is the superiority of Jesus Christ over Napoleon. "Reload your guns," said Enjolras. How was the casing of the barricade going to behave under the cannon balls? Would they effect a breach? That was the question. While the insurgents were reloading their guns, the artillerymen were loading the cannon. The anxiety in the redoubt was profound. The shot sped, the report burst forth. "Present!" shouted a joyous voice, and Gavroche flung himself into the barricade just as the ball dashed against it. He came from the direction of the Rue du Cygne, and he had nimbly climbed over the auxiliary barricade which fronted on the labyrinth of the Rue de la Petite Truanderie. Gavroche produced a greater sensation in the barricade than the cannon ball. The ball buried itself in the mass of rubbish. At the most, there was an omnibus wheel broken, and the old Anceau cart was demolished. On seeing this, the barricade burst into a laugh. "Go on!" shouted Bossuet to the artillerists. Chapter 8. The artillerymen compel people to take them seriously. They flocked around Gavroche, but he had no time to tell anything. Marius drew him aside with a shudder. "What are you doing here?" "Hello," said the child, "what are you doing here yourself?" And he stared at Marius intently with his epic effrontery. His eyes grew larger with the proud light within them. It was with an accent of severity that Marius continued. "Who told you to come back? Did you deliver my letter at the address?" Gavroche was not without some compunctions in the matter of that letter. In his haste to return to the barricade, he had got rid of it rather than delivered it. He was forced to acknowledge to himself that he had confided it rather lightly to that stranger whose face he had not been able to make out. It is true that the man was bareheaded, but that was not sufficient. In short, he had been administering to himself little inward remonstrances, and he feared Marius's reproaches. In order to extricate himself from the predicament, he took the simplest course. He lied abominably. "Citizen, I delivered the letter to the porter. The lady was asleep. She will have the letter when she wakes up." Marius had had two objects in sending that letter: to bid farewell to Cosette and to save Gavroche. He was obliged to content himself with the half of his desire. The dispatch of his letter and the presence of M. Fauchelevent in the barricade was a coincidence which occurred to him. He pointed out M. Fauchelevent to Gavroche. "Do you know that man?" "No," said Gavroche. Gavroche had, in fact, as we have just mentioned, seen Jean Valjean only at night. The troubled and unhealthy conjectures which had outlined themselves in Marius's mind were dissipated. Did he know M. Fauchelevent's opinions? Perhaps M. Fauchelevent was a Republican. Hence his very natural presence in this combat. In the meanwhile, Gavroche was shouting at the other end of the barricade, "My gun!" Courfeyrac had it returned to him. Gavroche warned his comrades, as he called them, that the barricade was blocked. He had had great difficulty in reaching it. A battalion of the line, whose arms were piled in the Rue de la Petite Truanderie, was on the watch on the side of the Rue du Cygne. On the opposite side, the municipal guard occupied the Rue des Prêcheurs. The bulk of the army was facing them in front. This information given, Gavroche added, "I authorize you to hit him a tremendous whack." Meanwhile, Enjolras was straining his ears and watching at his embrasure. The assailants, dissatisfied no doubt with their shot, had not repeated it. A company of infantry of the line had come up and occupied the end of the street behind the piece of ordnance. The soldiers were tearing up the pavement and constructing with the stones a small, low wall, a sort of side work not more than 18 inches high, and facing the barricade. In the angle at the left of this épaulement there was visible the head of the column of a battalion from the suburbs, massed in the Rue Saint-Denis. Enjolras, on the watch, thought he distinguished the peculiar sound which is produced when the shells of grape shot are drawn from the caissons, and he saw the commander of the piece change the elevation and incline the mouth of the cannon slightly to the left. Then the cannoneers began to load the piece. The chief seized the lintstock himself and lowered it to the vent. "Down with your heads, hug the wall," shouted Enjolras, "and all on your knees along the barricade." The insurgents, who were straggling in front of the wine shop and who had quitted their posts of combat on Gavroche's arrival, rushed pell-mell towards the barricade. But before Enjolras' order could be executed, the discharge took place with the terrifying rattle of a round of grape shot. This is what it was, in fact. The charge had been aimed at the cut in the redoubt and had there rebounded from the wall, and this terrible rebound had produced 2 dead and 3 wounded. If this were continued, the barricade was no longer tenable. The grape shot made its way in. A murmur of consternation arose. "Let us prevent the second discharge," said Enjolras, and lowering his rifle, he took aim at the captain of the gun, who at that moment was bearing down on the breech of his gun and rectifying and definitely fixing its pointing. The captain of the piece was a handsome sergeant of artillery, very young, blond, with a very gentle face, and the intelligent air peculiar to that predestined and redoubtable weapon which, by dint of perfecting itself in horror, must end in killing war. Combeferre, who was standing beside Enjolras, scrutinized this young man. "What a pity," said Combeferre. "What hideous things these butcheries are. Come, when there are no more kings, there will be no more war. Enjolras, you are taking aim at that sergeant. You are not looking at him. Fancy, he is a charming young man. He is intrepid. It is evident that he is thoughtful. Those young artillerymen are very well educated. He has a father, a mother, a family. He's probably in love. He's not more than 25 at the most. He might be your brother." "He is," said Enjolras. "Yes," replied Combeferre, "he is mine too. Well, let us not kill him. Let me alone, it must be done." And a tear trickled slowly down Enjolras' marble cheek. At the same moment he pressed the trigger of his rifle. The flame leaped forth. The artilleryman turned around twice, his arms extended in front of him, his head uplifted as though for breath. Then he fell with his side on the gun and lay there motionless. They could see his back, from the center of which there flowed directly a stream of blood. The ball had transversed his breast from side to side. He was dead. He had to be carried away and replaced by another. Several minutes were thus gained, in fact. End of Book 1, Chapters 7 and 8. 9 through 11
of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hapgood. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapters 9 through 11. Chapter 9. Employment of the old talents of a poacher, and that infallible marksmanship which influenced the condemnation of 1796. Opinions were exchanged in the barricade. The firing from the gun was about to begin again. Against that grape shot they could not hold out a quarter of an hour longer. It was absolutely necessary to deaden the blows. Enjolras issued this command: "We must place a mattress there." "We have none," said Combeferre. "The wounded are lying on them." Jean Valjean, who was seated apart on a stone post at the corner of the tavern with his gun between his knees, had, up to that moment, taken no part in anything that was going on. He did not appear to hear the combatants saying around him, "Here is a gun that is doing nothing." At the order issued by Enjolras, he rose. It will be remembered that on the arrival of the rabble in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, an old woman, foreseeing the bullets, had placed her mattress in front of her window. This window, an attic window, was on the roof of a 6-story house situated a little beyond the barricade. The mattress, placed crosswise, supported at the bottom on 2 poles for drying linen, was upheld at the top by 2 ropes, which, at that distance, looked like 2 threads, and which were attached to 2 nails planted in the window frames. These ropes were distinctly visible, like hairs against the sky. "Can someone lend me a double-barreled rifle?" said Jean Valjean. Enjolras, who had just reloaded his, handed it to him. Jean Valjean took aim at the attic window and fired. One of the mattress ropes was cut. The mattress now hung by 1 thread only. Jean Valjean fired the second charge. The second rope lashed the panes of the attic window. The mattress slipped between the 2 poles and fell into the street. The barricade applauded. All voices cried, "Here is a mattress!" "Yes," said Combeferre, "but who will go and fetch it?" The mattress had, in fact, fallen outside the barricade, between besiegers and besieged. Now, the death of the sergeant of artillery having exasperated the troop, the soldiers had for several minutes been lying flat on their stomachs behind the line of paving stones which they had erected, and, in order to supply the forced silence of the piece, which was quiet while its service was in course of reorganization, they had opened fire on the barricade. The insurgents did not reply to this musketry in order to spare their ammunition. The fusillade broke against the barricade, but the street which it filled was terrible. Jean Valjean stepped out of the cut, entered the street, traversed the storm of bullets, walked up to the mattress, hoisted it upon his back, and returned to the barricade. He placed the mattress in the cut with his own hands. He fixed it there against the wall in such a manner that the artillerymen should not see it. That done, they awaited the next discharge of grape shot. It was not long in coming. The cannon vomited forth its package of buckshot with a roar. But there was no rebound. The effect which they had foreseen had been attained. The barricade was saved. "Citizen," said Enjolras to Jean Valjean, "the Republic thanks you." Bossuet admired and laughed. He exclaimed, "It is immoral that a mattress should have so much power. Triumph of that which yields over that which strikes with lightning. But never mind, glory to the mattress, which annuls a cannon." End of Book 1, Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Dawn.
At that moment Cosette awoke. Her chamber was narrow, neat, unobtrusive, with a long sash window facing the east on the back courtyard of the house. Cosette knew nothing of what was going on in Paris. She had not been there on the preceding evening, and she had already retired to her chamber when Toussaint had said, "It appears that there is a row." Cosette had slept only a few hours, but soundly. She had had sweet dreams, which possibly arose from the fact that her little bed was very white. Someone, who was Marius, had appeared to her in the light. She awoke with the sun in her eyes, which at first produced on her the effect of being a continuation of her dream. Her first thought on emerging from this dream was a smiling one. Cosette felt herself thoroughly reassured. Like Jean Valjean, she had, a few hours previously, passed through that reaction of the soul which absolutely will not hear of unhappiness. She began to cherish hope with all her might, without knowing why. Then she felt a pang at her heart. It was 3 days since she had seen Marius, but she said to herself that he must have received her letter, that he knew where she was, and that he was so clever that he would find means of reaching her, and that certainly today, and perhaps that very morning. It was broad daylight, but the rays of light were very horizontal. She thought that it was very early, but that she must rise nevertheless in order to receive Marius. She felt that she could not live without Marius, and that consequently that was sufficient, and that Marius would come. No objection was valid. All this was certain. It was monstrous enough already to have suffered for 3 days. Marius absent 3 days. This was horrible on the part of the good God. Now this cruel teasing from on high had been gone through with. Marius was about to arrive, and he would bring good news. Youth is made thus. It quickly dries its eyes. It finds sorrow useless and does not accept it. Youth is the smile of the future in the presence of an unknown quantity, which is itself. It is natural to it to be happy. It seems as though its respiration were made of hope. Moreover, Cosette could not remember what Marius had said to her on the subject of this absence which was to last only 1 day, and what explanation of it he had given her. Every one has noticed with what nimbleness a coin which one has dropped on the ground rolls away and hides, and with what art it renders itself undiscoverable. There are thoughts which play us the same trick. They nestle away in a corner of our brain. That is the end of them. They are lost. It is impossible to lay the memory on them. Cosette was somewhat vexed at the useless little effort made by her memory. She told herself that it was very naughty and very wicked of her to have forgotten the words uttered by Marius. She sprang out of bed, and accomplished the 2 ablutions of soul and body, her prayers and her toilette. One may, in any case of exigency, introduce the reader into a nuptial chamber, not into a virginal chamber. Verse would hardly venture it, prose must not. It is the interior of a flower that is not yet unfolded. It is whiteness in the dark. It is the private cell of a closed lily, which must not be gazed upon by man so long as the sun has not gazed upon it. Woman in the bud is sacred. That innocent bud which opens, that adorable half-nudity which is afraid of itself, that white foot which takes refuge in a slipper, that throat which veils itself before a mirror as though a mirror were an eye, that chemise which makes haste to rise up and conceal the shoulder for a creaking bit of furniture or a passing vehicle, those cords tied, those clasps fastened, those laces drawn, those tremors, those shivers of cold and modesty, that exquisite affright in every movement, that almost winged uneasiness where there is no cause for alarm, the successive phases of dressing, as charming as the clouds of dawn. It is not fitting that all this should be narrated, and it is too much to have even called attention to it. The eye of man must be more religious in the presence of the rising of a young girl than in the presence of the rising of a star. The possibility of hurting should inspire an augmentation of respect. The down on the peach, the bloom on the plum, the radiated crystal of the snow, the wing of the butterfly powdered with feathers, are coarse compared to that chastity which does not even know that it is chaste. The young girl is only the flash of a dream, and is not yet a statue. Her bedchamber is hidden in the somber part of the ideal. The indiscreet touch of a glance brutalizes this vague penumbra. Here contemplation is profanation. We shall therefore show nothing of that sweet little flutter of Cosette's rising. An Oriental tale relates how the rose was made white by God, but that Adam looked upon her when she was unfolding, and she was ashamed and turned crimson. We are of the number who fall speechless in the presence of young girls and flowers, since we think them worthy of veneration. Cosette dressed herself very hastily, combed and dressed her hair, which was a very simple matter in those days, when women did not swell out their curls and bands with cushions and puffs, and did not put crinoline in their locks. Then she opened the window and cast her eyes around in every direction, hoping to descry some bit of the street, an angle of the house, an edge of pavement, so that she might be able to watch for Marius there. But no view of the outside was to be had. The back court was surrounded by tolerably high walls, and the outlook was only on several gardens. Cosette pronounced these gardens hideous. For the first time in her life she found flowers ugly. The smallest scrap of the gutter of the street would have met her wishes better. She decided to gaze at the sky as though she thought that Marius might come from that quarter. All at once she burst into tears. Not that this was fickleness of soul, but hopes cut in twain by dejection. That was her case. She had a confused consciousness of something horrible. Thoughts were rife in the air, in fact. She told herself that she was not sure of anything, that to withdraw herself from sight was to be lost, and the idea that Marius could return to her from heaven appeared to her no longer charming but mournful. Then, as is the nature of these clouds, calm returned to her, and hope, and a sort of unconscious smile, which yet indicated trust in God. Everyone in the house was still asleep. A country-like silence reigned. Not a shutter had been opened. The porter's lodge was closed. Toussaint had not risen, and Cosette naturally thought that her father was asleep. She must have suffered much, and she must have still been suffering greatly, for she said to herself that her father had been unkind. But she counted on Marius. The eclipse of such a light was decidedly impossible. Now and then she heard sharp shocks in the distance, and she said, "It is odd that people should be opening and shutting their carriage gates so early." They were the reports of the cannon battering the barricade. A few feet below Cosette's window, in the ancient and perfectly black cornice of the wall, There was a martin's nest. The curve of this nest formed a little projection beyond the cornice, so that from above it was possible to look into this little paradise. The mother was there, spreading her wings like a fan over her brood. The father fluttered about, flew away, then came back, bearing in his beak food and kisses. The dawning day gilded this happy thing. The great law, multiply, lay there smiling and august, and that sweet mystery unfolded in the glory of the morning. Cosette, with her hair in the sunlight, her soul absorbed in chimeras, illumined by love within and by the dawn without, bent over mechanically, and almost without daring to avow to herself that she was thinking at the same time of Marius, began to gaze at these birds, at this family, at that male and female, that mother and her little ones, with the profound trouble which a nest produces on a virgin. End of Book 1, Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Shot Which Misses Nothing and Kills No One. The assailants' fire continued. Musketry and grape shot alternated, but without committing great ravages, to tell the truth. The top alone of the Corinth façade suffered. The window on the first floor and the attic window in the roof, riddled with buckshot and Biscayans, were slowly losing their shape. The combatants who had been posted there had been obliged to withdraw. However, this is according to the tactics of barricades, to fire for a long while in order to exhaust the insurgents' ammunition if they commit the mistake of replying. When it is perceived from the slackening of their fire that they have no more powder and ball, the assault is made. Enjolras had not fallen into this trap. The barricade did not reply. At every discharge by platoons, Gavroche puffed out his cheek with his tongue, a sign of supreme disdain. "Good for you," said he. "Rip up the cloth. We want some lint." Courfeyrac called the grape shot to order for the little effect which it produced, and said to the cannon, "You are growing diffuse, my good fellow." One gets puzzled in battle as at a ball. It is probable that this silence on the part of the redoubt began to render the besiegers uneasy, and to make them fear some unexpected incident, and that they felt the necessity of getting a clear view behind that heap of paving stones, and of knowing what was going on behind that impassable wall which received blows without retorting. The insurgents suddenly perceived a helmet glittering in the sun on a neighboring roof. A fireman had placed his back against a tall chimney and seemed to be acting as sentinel. His glance fell directly down into the barricade. "There's an embarrassing watcher," said Enjolras. Jean Valjean had returned Enjolras' rifle, but he had his own gun. Without saying a word, he took aim at the fireman, and a second later the helmet, smashed by a bullet, rattled noisily into the street. The terrified soldier made haste to disappear. A second observer took his place. This one was an officer. Jean Valjean, who had reloaded his gun, took aim at the newcomer, and sent the officer's casque to join the soldiers. The officer did not persist, and retired speedily. This time the warning was understood. No one made his appearance thereafter on that roof, and the idea of spying on the barricade was abandoned. "Why did you not kill the man, Bossuet?" asked Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean made no reply. End of Book 1, Chapters 9 through 11.
Chapters 12 and 13 of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ella Jane Quentin. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1. The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 12. Disorder, a Partisan of Order. Bossuet muttered in Combeferre's ear. He did not answer my question. "He is a man who does good by gunshots," said Combeferre. Those who have preserved some memory of this already distant epoch know that the National Guard from the suburbs was valiant against insurrections. It was particularly zealous and intrepid in the days of June, 1832. A certain good dram shopkeeper of Pantin de Vertu, or La Cunette, whose establishment had been closed by the riots, became leonine at the sight of his deserted dance-hall, and got himself killed to preserve the order represented by a tea-garden. In that bourgeois and heroic time, in the presence of ideas which had their knights, interests had their paladins, the prosiness of the originators detracted nothing from the bravery of the movement. The diminution of a pile of crowns made bankers sing the Marseillaise. They shed their blood lyrically for the counting-house, and they defended the shop, that immense diminutive of the fatherland, with Lacedaemonian enthusiasm. At bottom, we will observe, there was nothing in all this that was not extremely serious. It was social elements entering into strife, while awaiting the day when they should enter into equilibrium. Another sign of the times was the anarchy mingled with governmentalism, the barbarous name of the correct party. People were for order in combination with a lack of discipline. The drum suddenly beat capricious calls. At the command of such or such a colonel of the National Guard, such and such a captain went into action through inspiration. Such and such National Guardsmen fought for an idea, and on their own account. At critical moments, on days, they took counsel less of their leaders than of their instincts. There existed in the army of order veritable guerrillas, some of the sword, like Fannicot, others of the pen, like Henri Fonfrède. Civilization, unfortunately, represented at this epoch rather by an aggregation of interests than by a group of principles, was, or thought itself, in peril. It set up the cry of alarm, each constituting himself a centre, defended it, succoured it, and protected it with his own head, and the first comer took it upon himself to save society. Zeal sometimes proceeded to extermination. A platoon of the National Guard would constitute itself on its own authority a private council of war, and judge and execute a captured insurgent in 5 minutes. It was an improvisation of this sort that had slain Jean Prouvaire. Fierce lynch law, with which no one party had any right to reproach the rest, for it has been applied by the Republic in America as well as by the monarchy in Europe. This lynch law was complicated with mistakes. On one day of rioting, a young poet named Paul M. Garnier was pursued in the Place Royale with a bayonet at his loins, and only escaped by taking refuge under the porte-cochere of No. 6. They shouted, "There's another of those Saint-Simonians," and they wanted to kill him. Now, he had under his arm a volume of the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon. A National Guard had read the words Saint-Simon on the book, and had shouted death. On the 6th of June, 1832, a company of the National Guards from the suburbs, commanded by the Captain Fannicot, above mentioned, had itself decimated in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, out of caprice and its own good pleasure. This fact, singular though it may seem, was proved at the judicial investigation opened in consequence of the insurrection of 1832. Captain Fannicot, a bold and impatient bourgeois, a sort of condottiere of the order of those whom we have just characterized, a fanatical and intractable governmentalist, could not resist the temptation to fire prematurely, and the ambition of capturing the barricade alone and unaided, that is to say, with his company. Exasperated by the successive apparition of the red flag and the old coat which he took for the black flag, he loudly blamed the generals and chiefs of the corps, who were holding council and did not think that the moment for decisive assault had arrived, and who were allowing the insurrection to fry in its own fat, to use the celebrated expression of one of them. For his part, he thought the barricade ripe, and as that which is ripe ought to fall, he made the attempt. He commanded men as resolute as himself, raging fellows, as a witness said. His company, the same which had shot Jean Prouvaire the poet, was the first of the battalion posted at the angle of the street. At the moment they were least expecting it, the captain launched his men against the barricade. This movement, executed with more good-will than strategy, cost the Fannicot Company dear. Before it had traversed 2/3 of the street, it was received by a general discharge from the barricade. 4, the most audacious, who were running on in front, were mown down point-blank at the very foot of the redoubt, and this courageous throng of National Guards, very brave men, but lacking in military tenacity, were forced to fall back, after some hesitation, leaving 15 corpses on the pavement. This momentary hesitation gave the insurgents time to reload their weapons, and a second and very destructive discharge struck the company before it could regain the corner of the street, its shelter. A moment more, and it was caught between 2 fires, and it received the volley from the battery piece, which, not having received the order, had not discontinued its firing. The intrepid and imprudent Fannicot was one of the dead from this grape-shot. He was killed by the cannon, that is to say, by order. This attack, which was more furious than serious, irritated Enjolras. "The fools," said he, "they are getting their own men killed, and they are using up our ammunition for nothing." Enjolras spoke like the real general of the insurrection, which he was. Insurrection and repression do not fight with equal weapons. Insurrection, which is speedily exhausted, has only a certain number of shots to fire and a certain number of combatants to expend. An empty cartridge box, a man killed, cannot be replaced. As repression has the army, it does not count its men, and as it has Vincennes, it does not count its shots. Repression has as many regiments as the barricade has men, and as many arsenals as the barricade has cartridge boxes. Thus they are struggles of 1 against 100, which always end in crushing the barricade, unless the revolution, uprising suddenly, flings into the balance its flaming archangel's sword. This does happen sometimes. Then everything rises, the pavements begin to seethe, popular redoubts abound. Paris quivers supremely. The quid divinum is given forth. A 10th of August is in the air, a 29th of July is in the air. A wonderful light appears. The yawning maw of force draws back, and the army, that lion, sees before it, erect and tranquil, that prophet, France. Chapter 13. Passing Gleams. In the chaos of sentiments and passions which defend a barricade, there is a little of everything. There is bravery, there is youth, honor, enthusiasm, the ideal, conviction, the rage of the gambler, and, above all, intermittences of hope. One of these intermittences, one of these vague quivers of hope, suddenly traversed the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie at the moment when it was least expected. "Listen!" suddenly cried Enjolras, who was still on the watch. "It seems to me that Paris is waking up." It is certain that, on the morning of the 6th of June, the insurrection broke out afresh for an hour or two, to a certain extent. The obstinacy of the alarm peal of Saint-Merry reanimated some fancies. Barricades were begun in the Rue du Poirier and the Rue des Gravilliers. In front of the Porte Saint-Martin, a young man, armed with a rifle, attacked alone a squadron of cavalry. In plain sight, on the open boulevard, he placed one knee on the ground, shouldered his weapon, fired, killed the commander of the squadron, and turned away, saying, "There's another who will do us no more harm." He was put to the sword. In the Rue Saint-Denis, a woman fired on the National Guard from behind a lowered blind. The slats of the blind could be seen to tremble at every shot. A child 14 years of age was arrested in the Rue de la Cossonnerie, with his pockets full of cartridges. Many posts were attacked. At the entrance to the Rue Bertin-Poiré, a very lively and utterly unexpected fusillade welcomed a regiment of cuirassiers, at whose head marched Marshal General Cavaignac de Baraque. In the Rue Planche-Mibray, they threw old pieces of pottery and household utensils down on the soldiers from the roofs. A bad sign, and when this matter was reported to Marshal Soult, Napoleon's old lieutenant grew thoughtful, as he recalled Suchet's saying at Saragossa, "We are lost when the old women empty their pot de chambre on our heads." These general symptoms, which presented themselves at the moment when it was thought that the uprising had been rendered local, this fever of wrath, these sparks which flew hither and thither above those deep masses of combustibles which are called the faubourgs of Paris, all this, taken together, disturbed the military chiefs. They made haste to stamp out these beginnings of conflagration. They delayed the attack on the barricades Maubert, de la Chauvière, and Saint-Merry until these sparks had been extinguished, in order that they might have to deal with the barricades only, and be able to finish them at one blow. Columns were thrown into the streets where there was fermentation, sweeping the large, sounding the small right and left, now slowly and cautiously, now at full charge. The troops broke in the doors of houses whence shots had been fired. At the same time, maneuvers by the cavalry dispersed the groups on the boulevards. This repression was not effected without some commotion, and without that tumultuous uproar peculiar to collisions between the army and the people. This is what Enjolras had caught up in the intervals of the cannonade and the musketry. Moreover, he had seen wounded men passing the end of the street in litters, and he said to Courfeyrac, "These wounded do not come from us." Their hope did not last long. The gleam was quickly eclipsed. In less than half an hour, what was in the air vanished. It was a flash of lightning, unaccompanied by thunder, and the insurgents felt that sort of leaden cope, with the indifference of the people casts over obstinate and deserted men, fall over them once more. The general movement, which seemed to have assumed a vague outline, had miscarried, and the attention of the Minister of War and the strategy of the generals could now be concentrated on the 3 or 4 barricades which still remained standing. The sun was mounting above the horizon. An insurgent hailed Enjolras. "We are hungry here. Are we really going to die like this, without anything to eat?" Enjolras, who was still leaning on his elbows at his embrasure, made an affirmative sign with his head, but without taking his eyes from the end of the street. End of Book 1, Chapter 13. Chapters 14 to 15 of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ella Jane Quentin. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapters 14 to 15. Chapter 14, wherein will appear the name of Enjolras' mistress. Courfeyrac, seated on a paving stone beside Enjolras, continued to insult the cannon, and each time that gloomy cloud of projectiles, which is called grape-shot, passed overhead with its terrible sound, he assailed it with a burst of irony. "You are wearing out your lungs, poor brutal old fellow. You pain me. You are wasting your row. That's not thunder, it's a cough." And the bystanders laughed. Courfeyrac and Bossuet, whose brave good humour increased with the peril, like Madame Scarron, replaced nourishment with pleasantry, and as wine was lacking, they poured out gaiety to all. "I admire Enjolras," said Bossuet. "His impassive temerity astounds me. He lives alone, which renders him a little sad, perhaps. Enjolras complains of his greatness, which binds him to widowhood. The rest of us have mistresses, more or less, who make us crazy, that is to say, brave. When a man is as much in love as a tiger, the least that he can do is fight like a lion. That is one way of taking our revenge for the capers that Mesdames our grisettes play on us. Roland gets himself killed for Angelique. All our heroism comes from our women. A man without a woman is a pistol without a trigger. It is the woman that sets the man off. Well, Enjolras has no woman. He is not in love, and yet he manages to be intrepid. It is a thing unheard of that a man should be as cold as ice and as bold as fire." Enjolras did not appear to be listening, but had anyone been near him, that person would have heard him mutter in a low voice, "Patria." Bossuet was still laughing when Courfeyrac exclaimed, "News!" and, assuming the tone of an usher making an announcement, he added, "My name is 8-pounder." In fact, a new personage had entered on the scene. This was a second piece of ordnance. The artillerymen rapidly performed their manoeuvres in force, and placed this second piece in line with the first. This outlined the catastrophe. A few minutes later, the two pieces, rapidly served, were firing point blank at the redoubt. The platoon firing of the line and of the soldiers from the suburbs sustained the artillery. Another cannonade was audible at some distance. At the same time that the two guns were furiously attacking the redoubt from the Rue de la Chanvrerie, two other cannons, trained one from the Rue Saint-Denis, the other from the Rue Aubry-le-Boucher, were riddling the Saint-Merry barricade. The 4 cannons echoed each other mournfully. The barking of these sombre dogs of war replied to each other. One of the 2 pieces which was now battering the barricade on the Rue de la Chanvrerie was firing grape-shot, the other balls. The piece which was firing balls was pointed a little high, and the aim was calculated so that the ball struck the extreme edge of the upper crest of the barricade, and crumbled the stone down upon the insurgents, mingled with bursts of grape-shot. The object of this mode of firing was to drive the insurgents from the summit of the redoubt, and to compel them to gather close in the interior, that is to say, this announced the assault. The combatants once driven from the crest of the barricade by balls, and from the windows of the cabaret by grape-shot, the attacking columns could venture into the street without being picked off, perhaps even without being seen, could briskly and suddenly scale the redoubt, as on the preceding evening, and, who knows, take it by surprise. It is absolutely necessary that the inconvenience of those guns should be diminished, said Enjolras, and he shouted, "Fire on the artillerymen!" All were ready. The barricade, which had long been silent, poured forth a desperate fire. 7 or 8 discharges followed, with a sort of rage and joy. The street was filled with blinding smoke, and at the end of a few minutes, athwart this mist all streaked with flame, 2/3 of the gunners could be distinguished lying beneath the wheels of the cannons. Those who were left standing continued to serve the pieces with severe tranquillity, but the fire had slackened. "Things are going well now," said Bossuet to Enjolras. "Success!" Enjolras shook his head, and replied, "Another quarter of an hour of this success, and there will not be any cartridges left in the barricade." It appears that Gavroche overheard this remark. Chapter 15. Gavroche outside. Courfeyrac suddenly caught sight of some one at the base of the barricade, outside in the street, amid the bullets. Gavroche had taken a bottle basket from the wine shop, had made his way out through the cut, and was quietly engaged in emptying the full cartridge boxes of the National Guardsmen, who had been killed on the slope of the redoubt, into his basket. "What are you doing there?" asked Courfeyrac. Gavroche raised his face. "I'm filling my basket, citizen." "Don't you see the grape-shot?" Gavroche replied, "Well, it is raining, what then?" Courfeyrac shouted, "Come in!" "Instanter," said Gavroche, and with a single bound he plunged into the street. It will be remembered that Fannicot's company had left behind it a trail of bodies. 20 corpses lay scattered here and there on the pavement, through the whole length of the street. 20 cartouches for Gavroche meant a provision of cartridges for the barricade. The smoke in the street was like a fog. Whoever has beheld a cloud which has fallen into a mountain gorge between 2 peaked escarpments can imagine this smoke rendered denser and thicker by 2 gloomy rows of lofty houses. It rose gradually and was incessantly renewed, hence a twilight which made even the broad daylight turn pale. The combatants could hardly see each other from one end of the street to the other, short as it was. This obscurity, which had probably been desired and calculated on by the commanders who were to direct the assault on the barricade, was useful to Gavroche. Beneath the folds of this veil of smoke, and thanks to his small size, he could advance tolerably far into the street without being seen. He rifled the first 7 or 8 cartridge boxes without much danger. He crawled flat on his belly, galloped on all fours, took his basket in his teeth, twisted, glided, undulated, wound from one dead body to another, and emptied the cartridge box or cartouche as a monkey opens a nut. They did not dare to shout to him to return from the barricade, which was quite near, for fear of attracting attention to him. On one body, that of a corporal, he found a powder flask. "For thirst," said he, putting it in his pocket. By dint of advancing, he reached a point where the fog of the fusillade became transparent, so that the sharpshooters of the line ranged on the outlook behind their paving stone dike, and the sharpshooters of the banlieue massed at the corner of the street, suddenly pointed out to each other something moving through the smoke. At the moment when Gavroche was relieving a sergeant, who was lying near a stone doorpost, of his cartridges, a bullet struck the body. "Fichtre!" ejaculated Gavroche, "they are killing my dead men for me." A second bullet struck a spark from the pavement beside him, a third overturned his basket. Gavroche looked and saw that this came from the men of the banlieue. He sprang to his feet, stood erect, with his hair flying in the wind, his hands on his hips, his eyes fixed on the National Guardsmen who were firing, and sang: On est laïd à Nanterre, c'est la faute à Voltaire, et bête à Palaiseau, c'est la faute à Rousseau. Men are ugly at Nanterre, 'tis the fault of Voltaire, and dull at Palaiseau, 'tis the fault of Rousseau. Then he picked up his basket, replaced the cartridges which had fallen from it without missing a single one, and advancing toward the fusillade, set about plundering another cartridge box. There a fourth bullet missed him again. Gavroche sang: Je ne suis pas notaire, c'est la faute à Voltaire. Je suis un petit oiseau, c'est la faute à Rousseau. I am not a notary, 'tis the fault of Voltaire. I'm a little bird, 'tis the fault of Rousseau. A fifth bullet only succeeded in drawing from him a third couplet. Joie est mon caractère, c'est la faute à Voltaire. Misère est mon trousseau, c'est la faute à Rousseau. Joy is my character, 'tis the fault of Voltaire. Misery is my trousseau, 'tis the fault of Rousseau. Thus it went on for some time. It was a charming and terrible sight. Gavroche, though shot at, was teasing the fusillade. He had the air of being greatly diverted. It was the sparrow pecking at the sportsman. To each discharge he retorted with a couplet. They aimed at him constantly, and always missed him. The National Guardsmen and the soldiers laughed as they took aim at him. He lay down, sprang to his feet, hid in the corner of a doorway, then made a bound, disappeared, reappeared, scampered away, returned, replied to the grape-shot with his thumb at his nose, and all the while went on pillaging the cartouches, emptying the cartridge boxes, and filling his basket. The insurgents, panting with anxiety, followed him with their eyes. The barricade trembled. He sang. He was not a child, he was not a man, he was a strange gamin fairy. He might have been called the invulnerable dwarf of the fray. The bullets flew after him, he was more nimble than they. He played a fearful game of hide-and-seek with death. Every time that the flat-nosed face of the spectre approached, the urchin administered to it a fillip. One bullet, however, better aimed or more treacherous than the rest, finally struck the will-o'-the-wisp of a child. Gavroche was seen to stagger, then he sank to the earth. The whole barricade gave vent to a cry, but there was something of Antaeus in that pygmy. For the gamin to touch the pavement is the same as for the giant to touch the earth. Gavroche had fallen only to rise again. He remained in a sitting posture, a long thread of blood streaked his face. He raised both arms in the air, glanced in the direction whence the shot had come, and began to sing. Je suis tombé par terre, c'est la faute à Voltaire. Le nez dans le ruisseau, c'est la faute à... I have fallen to the earth, 'tis the fault of Voltaire. With my nose in the gutter, 'tis the fault of... He did not finish. A second bullet from the same marksman stopped him short. This time he fell face downward on the pavement, and moved no more. This grand little soul had taken its flight. End of Book 1, Chapters 14 to 15.
Of Book 1 of Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karen. Les Miserables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1, Chapter 16. How from a brother one becomes a father. At that same